Welcome friends, this is part 2 of the cam phaser video series. I am removing the pulleys, intake manifold, valve covers, and finally the timing cover to get to the cam phasers themselves. Last video I only removed the air and cooling hoses and pipes, so now I'm getting everything else off the timing cover. To remove the serpentine belt, I used a 15mm socket and breaker bar to rotate the tensioner pulley to the passenger side and then pull off the belt. My breaker bar got stuck because I started rotating from the 2 o'clock position and then the bar ended up hitting the air box with the belt removed. I should have started between 12 and 1 o'clock position from the engine. But you can also just use a standard ratchet. You don't have to use a breaker bar. It'll just take a little more work with a standard size ratchet. Next was the AC compressor belt, which is stretch fit. The Ford service manual recommends using a nylon strap wedged between the compressor pulley and the belt to pull the belt off. I tried this and failed with this method, and I didn't want to waste any time, so I just cut the belt off and then bought a new one. Next was the crankshaft pulley / harmonic balancer. I used an 18mm socket and impact wrench to remove the bolt, and a harmonic balancer removal tool that I rented from AutoZone to get the actual pulley off. Then I removed the idler pulley using a 13mm socket and ratchet, followed by removing the 2 10mm bolts that hold on the tensioner pulley. The water pump pulley rotates, so I used a 10mm socket with an impact to get that off. Next, I used an 8mm socket and various extensions to remove the 5 bolts which hold on the thermostat housing. I did need to be careful not to remove the additional 3 bolts which are on there, and that holds the thermostat inside of the housing. You can't see it well here, but I also removed the 2 8mm bolts holding the water pump outlet connector to the water pump, so I could pull them off without disconnecting the hose that goes in between. Then I removed the water pump's 9 bolts using an 8mm socket and ratchet and a pry bar to pop it off. Next was the alternator, which is connected with a terminal ring and harness connector. I used a 13mm socket to remove the nut holding on the ring, and then I unplugged the connector. Then I used a 15mm deep socket to remove the nut and bolt which hold the alternator onto the engine. It was stuck on pretty good, so I used a pry bar to rotate the alternator counterclockwise on that upper stud, and then I just pulled it out. Next, I unclipped the oil pump sensor wire and pried the wire retainers off the timing cover that run upward. And then I moved the wire up and out of the way. I started unclipping wires from the camshaft solenoids, throttle body, and PCV hoses which are connected to the intake manifold. With everything out of the way, I could use a 10mm socket and ratchet to remove the 8 bolts holding down the manifold. Once the intake manifold was off, I immediately stuck some colored microfiber towels in the exposed intake runners in the head. Next, I labeled all of the coils with a silver Sharpie based on the cylinder number. I disconnected their wires and wire retainers. Here I also unclipped the connectors running to the sensors on top of the driver's side valve cover to move that whole harness out of the way and off to the side. I do want to note here that there is a wire that runs down the driver's side of the engine and clips into a sensor. The sensor connector isn't a big deal, but it was very hard for me to remove the wire retainers from the engine. At this point, I also removed the vacuum hoses connected to the brake booster and IWE vacuum solenoid on the driver's side. I made reference to this in part 1. Finally, all the obstructions seemed like they were out of the way, so I could pull the coils and cover. Then I used an 8mm socket to remove the coil bolts and pulled the coils out. Finally, I could remove the driver's side valve cover using a 10mm socket and ratchet to loosen the 12 bolts holding it down. The bolts are captured, so no need to worry about dropping them, but sometimes they can slightly thread themselves back in, which is really annoying. I had a bit of trouble on the driver's side pulling off the cover. It seals on the spark plug wells and the cam solenoids, which are stuck on. They prevent the cover from actually coming off. I ended up carefully using some silicone spray on the rubber seals for the passenger side, which in the end ended up helping the seals start to slide. Over on the passenger side, I needed to pull the high pressure fuel pump off first. I used a 17mm wrench to loosen the hardline flare nut going to the pump, and then a 17mm crow foot with extension and ratchet to loosen the hard fuel line flare nut on the back of the engine running to the fuel rails. Note here, I was worried that the line was pressurized, but it wasn't at all. From my understanding, I would have only had to worry about the low pressure line running to the fuel tank. Anyway, there are two 8mm bolts holding the rail to the valve cover on the top and the engine on the back. With the hard line removed, I removed the coils using an 8mm socket and the high pressure fuel pump using a T45 Torx bit. I pried off the retainer for the low pressure line and moved the pump out of the way. Now I could loosen the 12 bolts holding down the valve cover and pull it out. After 45 minutes of struggling, and finally using silicone spray on the spark plug well and cam solenoid seals. Quick note here, a wire retainer, which had broken off, was sitting on the valve cover, and when I pulled it out, the retainer fell into the spark plug well. This took me about 30 minutes to get out because for some reason I didn't think to just vacuum it out, even though I actually bought a small hose attachment set and a new Milwaukee vacuum for this project, which would have done it perfectly. Also, I used a pry bar to help pull off the covers, making sure that I was only using solid spots for leverage and putting the sharp edge of the bar on non-sealing surfaces. This is important if I wasn't actually replacing the covers, but I personally wanted to avoid it just in case the new covers were wrong and I needed to reuse the old ones. Last part before removing the timing cover was taking the alternator wiring off the bottom of the cover. I used a 10mm deep socket to remove the nut holding the wiring to the passenger side of the cover, and a flathead screwdriver to unclip the driver's side. I was scared to pull the wiring out too far, which I ended up doing during reinstallation anyway, but here I used a 10mm wrench to remove the stud bolt. Now was the time to finally pull off the timing cover. I used a 13mm socket and ratchet to remove the 24 bolts holding on the timing cover. To help me keep track, I printed out the image from the service manual, taped it to a piece of cardboard, pre-punched some holes in it, and then I used it to retain the 3 different sizes of bolts that are on this timing cover. Earlier on, I had forgotten to use a 7mm socket to remove the alternator stud bolt, as this does go through both the timing cover and into the engine. With everything removed, I used the safest points that I could find to pry, and also here, the only thing holding this on tight are the seals, specifically the main coolant seal, which I used some silicone spray on to soften it up and slide it off with the timing cover. Alright, so final thoughts are that not much of this was easy for me. It was the little things like messing up the bar length on the harmonic balancer or trying to get the stupid wire retainers off. The valve covers were awful to remove, especially the passenger side, which, side note, I didn't realize how off-center the engine was. There is much less room on the passenger side. I cut a lot of video out of me just struggling with dumb stuff like the wire retainers. Also, in portions of the video you might see me wearing a respirator because the small amount of fuel that came out of the lines was actually pretty strong in the garage. I also made sure to wear eye protection while messing with the fuel lines for fear of pressurized chemicals getting me a second time. Also, I don't know if it's a big deal to use it, but the silicone spray lube helped so much with the passenger valve cover. Those seals were hard, and they were held on with like dirt and all kinds of gunk that was stuck on there. The reinstallation, which you'll see in part 4, requires fresh oil lubricant on the seals, in accordance with the Ford service manual. Either way, it was worth it to me, and I wish that I would have carefully put some silicone lube on all of the rubber seals before trying to remove all of the covers, both of the valve covers and the timing cover. The end of this video was about 14 hours total into the cam phaser repair, and I was about halfway through the second day. As before, obviously that includes reading the instructions, setting up the camera, getting lunch and snacks and drinks and stuff like that. Anywho, that's it for this video. Part 3 is the actual cam phasers and timing parts, and part 4 is the reassembly. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.